Improve your English through stories. There was a brother and sister who lived near a river at Dorcott Mill. The mill stood about a mile away from St. August town. Edward Tulliver was the miller, and he lived in a house next to the mill with his wife, Bessie Tulliver. They had 2 kids, a boy named Tom who was 11 and a girl named Maggie who was 9. One March afternoon in 1828, Mrs. Tulliver and Maggie waited outside for Mr. Tulliver and Tom to return from Tom's school break. Tom and his dad arrived in a cart. Tom greeted his mother and Maggie. Maggie was excited and wanted to buy more rabbits with the money she had. But Tom got upset because her previous rabbits had died as she forgot to feed them. He yelled at Maggie, making her cry. Maggie apologized, but Tom was still upset. Later, when everyone was having cake and tea, Maggie was crying in her room. Tom joined the family downstairs, ignoring Maggie's absence. When asked, he claimed he didn't know where she was, angering his parents. Finally, he went to find Maggie in her room. She apologized to the rabbits. Tom forgave her, telling her to stop crying, which made her smile. 10 days later, Mrs. Tulliver's sisters and their husbands visited with their daughter Lucy, who was 7 years old. Maggie's hair was messy, and the adults discussed cutting it shorter. Maggie got an idea and took Tom upstairs. She cut her hair with scissors and convinced Tom to help. Maggie and Tom were in the room, and Maggie's cut hair was all over the floor. Tom laughed at her, which upset Maggie. She thought people would make fun of her. Feeling sad, she went downstairs and sat quietly in the dining room. When Mrs. Tulliver saw Maggie's short hair, she screamed and dropped a plate. Everyone looked at Maggie, and Mr. Dean made fun of her, calling her a naughty girl. Maggie cried again and ran to her father for comfort. Mr. Tulliver reassured her that he loved her and would take care of her. After dinner, Tom, Maggie, and Lucy went to the garden while their parents talked to the guests. Mr. Tulliver shared his plan. He wanted Tom to have a good education with Mr. Stelling, learning history, math, and Latin. Mrs. Gregg disagreed, saying Tom should become a miller, but Mr. Tulliver insisted on a broader education. A disagreement arose between Mr. Tulliver and Mrs. Gregg about money. She had lent him £500, and Mr. Tulliver promised to pay her back soon. However, he didn't have the money at the moment. Desperate, he borrowed the amount from a friend and paid Mrs. Gregg later on. In August 1828, Tom began studying at Mr. Stelling's school. However, he felt lonely and unhappy there because the lessons were tough. The school was far from his home at King's Lawton, miles away from St. August. Tom didn't return to Dorcott Mill until December for the Christmas break. During his visit home, Tom questioned his father about learning Latin, expressing his dislike for the subject. He mentioned his uncle's success without learning Latin, but his father insisted that learning Latin would help him understand law, which was essential because of a dispute with a neighbor over water rights from the river Floss. Mr. Tulliver stressed the importance of understanding the law to help with their legal issues in court. Mr. Tulliver mentioned that lawyer Wakeham, who would represent their neighbor in court, was not a good man. Tom learned that Philip Wakeham, lawyer Wakeham's son, would join Mr. Stelling's school after Christmas. Although Philip was described as clever but physically weak with a twisted back, Tom was reassured that he was just as clever as Philip. When Tom returned to school after Christmas, he met Philip Wakeham in the library. Philip, older than Tom and with a sad face, introduced himself, and Tom responded politely as Tom Tulliver. In 1830, Tom Tulliver was 13 years old and had spent 2 years at Mr. Stelling's school. However, he found studying very hard because he wasn't naturally clever. On the contrary, Philip Wakeham, another student, was very smart and found the work easy. Meanwhile, Tom's younger sister Maggie, aged 11, regularly wrote letters to him, sharing news about Dorcott Mill and St. August. She was bright and kept Tom updated. Tom also wrote back to Maggie, inviting her to visit him at Mr. Stelling's school, mentioning that Mr. Stelling was kind and she could stay for a few days. Maggie planned to visit soon and Tom was excited. However, just before her visit, Tom found an old, sharp sword in the house. Thinking it would impress Maggie, he planned to show it to her. When Maggie arrived, they were in the library with Philip. Tom, wanting to surprise Maggie, asked her to close her eyes and then revealed the sword, pretending to be a soldier. But in his excitement, he accidentally cut his foot. Maggie, terrified, thought Tom was seriously hurt and cried out. Tom, though not seriously injured, had to stay in bed for a week. During this time, Maggie and Philip spent time together. Philip, feeling a connection to Maggie, quietly asked her if she would be like a sister to him since he didn't have one. Maggie reciprocated his feelings and expressed her fondness for him. Philip was sad because he wouldn't see Maggie again after she left for school, and he admired her beautiful dark eyes. They shared a quick kiss before parting ways. In 1833, Tom Tulliver was 16 and still studying at Mr. Stelling's school while Philip Wakeham had already left. On a cold November day, Maggie unexpectedly arrived at the school library. Tom, surprised to see her, asked why she wasn't at her school. Maggie brought devastating news. Their father had lost a lawsuit against Mr. Wakeham. Their family owed money to Mr. Wakeham's lawyer, and their father, already unwell and forgetful, couldn't pay. Their home and belongings were at risk of being taken away by Mr. Wakeham's men. Distraught, Tom shouted angrily, expressing hate towards Philip Wakeham. Together, Tom and Maggie returned to Dorcott Mill, where their mother was waiting, worried about losing everything the next day. The situation was dire. Mr. Tulliver's health had worsened, and they had lost their belongings. Family members arrived, concerned about their well-being and the loss of their education funds due to their financial crisis. Tom, desperate to help, asked his aunts for money but was denied. He sought a job from his uncle but was told that his education in Latin wouldn't be useful. However, he was offered a job in the office. Meanwhile, the notice of Dorcott Mill being sold was displayed publicly. Mr. Tulliver, bedridden for 2 months, finally got up and realized their dire situation. They had lost everything and owed more money to Mr. Wakeham. In a moment of sadness and desperation, Mr. Tulliver decided to write a statement, instructing Tom to work for Mr. Wakeham but never forgive or forget the harm caused to their family. However, Tom's insistence to add a statement expressing hatred towards the Wakehams led to disagreement between him and Maggie. During the challenging years that followed, the Tullivers faced hardships, especially Mr. Tulliver, who harbored a deep hatred for lawyer Wakeham. Despite his strong feelings, he had to work for the lawyer. Tom, on the other hand, worked for Guest & Company in St. August and saved all his earnings. Meanwhile, Maggie stayed at home, supporting her mother in managing the household. However, one June afternoon in 1837, Maggie's life took a turn. Exhausted, she wandered to a serene place called the Red Deeps, a beautiful spot with tall trees and soft red ground. Unexpectedly, she encountered Philip Wakeham there, whom she hadn't seen for 5 years. Philip had followed her, expressing his admiration for her beauty and sharing his own unhappiness about his physical condition. Their discussions continued secretly in the Red Deeps. Though Philip confessed his love for Maggie and desired to marry her, Maggie, feeling trapped by the hatred between their families, refused. Despite her feelings for Philip, she knew their relationship was impossible due to the family animosity. Their clandestine meetings continued for a year until one day, Tom spotted Maggie's shoes covered in red earth from the red deeps. Confronting her, Tom discovered her meetings with Philip. Enraged by this discovery, Tom scolded Maggie, accusing her of being a bad sister and daughter for associating with the enemy's son. The next day, Tom accompanied Maggie to the Red Deeps where Philip was waiting. Confrontation ensued between the brothers and Philip. Tom, in anger, attempted to harm Philip, calling him twisted in body and mind. Distraught, Maggie intervened, asking for forgiveness for the situation. Philip, understanding the complexities in Tom's unkindness, expressed his love for Maggie and criticized Tom's lack of love for her. As the conflict escalated, Maggie touched Philip's hand in a moment of empathy before he walked away. Tom, filled with anger, led Maggie back home, but Maggie couldn't help but express her disappointment and hurt at Tom's actions, deeming him cruel and unkind. In the weeks following the confrontation, Tom remained silent towards Maggie. One afternoon, he returned home with news for his father. He had managed to borrow money from Uncle Dean and traded wisely, amassing £320, enough to settle the debt owed to Lawyer Wakeham. The next day, Mr. Tulliver and Tom went to Lawyer Wakeham's office in St. August. Though the lawyer wasn't present, they left the £300 owed. Tom then headed to the office of Guest & Company, while Mr. Tulliver rode back home. At the mill, Lawyer Wakeham appeared and demanded to speak with Mr. Tulliver. The tension escalated, and in the heat of the moment, Mr. Tulliver, angered by Wakeham's taunts, ended up hitting him with his riding whip. Maggie and Mrs. Tulliver rushed out, pleading with Mr. Tulliver to stop, but the altercation continued until Lawyer Wakeham retreated. Mr. Tulliver, feeling unwell, was taken inside by Maggie and her mother. Maggie hurried to fetch Tom from the office. However, Mr. Tulliver's condition worsened, and while lying in bed, he advised Tom to use his savings to buy back the mill from Wakeham. As he lay there, he bid goodbye to his family, expressing his love for them before passing away. In the aftermath, Tom and Maggie, now left alone, promised to always love and support each other. The Tulliver family had to leave Dorlcote Mill behind. Tom lived independently, working hard while Mrs. Tulliver went to live with the Deans, Luce's family. Unfortunately, Mrs. Dean had passed away. Maggie, on the other hand, pursued teaching and became a schoolteacher. 2 years later, during a holiday in April 1840, she returned to visit Lucy at the Dean's house in St. Aug's. Lucy urged Maggie to stay, assuring her that Aunt Tulliver would take care of everyone. While there, Maggie and Lucy had a conversation about their lives. Lucy confessed her love for Stephen Guest, praising his intelligence, handsomeness, and shared interests in music with Philip Wakeham, who was currently in Italy. However, Maggie expressed reluctance in meeting Philip due to the past conflicts and disapproval from her family. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Stephen Guest, introduced by Lucy. Stephen was captivated by Maggie's beauty. Lucy, in hopes of fostering friendship, encouraged them both to get along. The following day, Maggie met with Tom in St. Aug's. She confided in him about Philip Wakeham's imminent return to St. Aug's, revealing Luce's connection to him. Tom, despite his dislike for Philip, understood Maggie's intentions and promised to support her desire to talk to Philip, emphasizing the importance of caution. They both pledged to be supportive siblings to each other, acknowledging and appreciating each other's efforts. Maggie found happiness at the Dean's house, enjoying the company of Lucy and Stephen. Their evenings were filled with boat rides on the river and joyous singing sessions. However, as time passed, Maggie and Stephen began to develop feelings for each other. One evening in May, while Maggie was reading in the garden, Stephen arrived with songs for Lucy. Learning that Philip Wakeham was due to visit the following day, Maggie felt unsettled. As she dropped her book, Stephen tried to comfort her, but he decided to leave, sensing her discomfort. The next morning, Philip arrived at the dean's house. Alone with Maggie, he expressed a desire to be friends, to which Maggie agreed, attempting to ease any tension between them. Shortly after, Lucy and Stephen joined them, and the group engaged in music. As Stephen sang, Maggie's radiant happiness was evident, causing Stephen and Philip to understand the depth of her feelings for Stephen. The dance at Park House brought moments of happiness for both Lucy and Maggie. Stephen danced joyfully with Lucy, while Maggie observed from afar, finding delight in the music and atmosphere. Although Stephen kept glancing at Maggie, he didn't initially approach her. However, when he finally did, they walked into the garden together, where Stephen made a regrettable move and kissed Maggie's arm repeatedly. Maggie, feeling upset and angry, firmly reminded Stephen of his affection for Lucy, urging him to leave and never meet her alone again. Despite her strong feelings for Stephen, Maggie was resolute about the need to honor Lucy's relationship with him. A few days later, Maggie encountered Stephen again by the river. He professed his love for her, and although Maggie reciprocated those feelings, she couldn't betray Lucy. Their emotional exchange ended in tears, with Maggie asking Stephen to leave, and despite the pain, she kissed him goodbye. Lucy had to leave for another town, so Stephen and Maggie planned to go boating together while Lucy was away. However, Stephen arrived alone, claiming Philip was unwell and Lucy was absent. Despite Maggie's initial refusal, Stephen convinced her to take a boat ride for just an hour. They got carried away and sailed far beyond their planned destination, losing track of time. As they realized they had passed Luckreth and were late, panic set in. Stephen, taking advantage of the moment, proposed marriage to Maggie. Overwhelmed and unable to think clearly, Maggie couldn't respond. Stephen continued rowing, leading them further away. They eventually boarded a steamboat heading to Mudport, where Stephen intended to marry Maggie, despite her distress and silence. Maggie, overwhelmed by the weight of her actions and the impact on Lucy and her own conscience, woke up on the steamboat with Stephen, deeply regretting what had transpired. She expressed her decision to Stephen that she couldn't go through with their plans. Stephen pleaded, stating he couldn't leave her, but Maggie was resolute. She realized the wrong in their actions, particularly the cruelty to Lucy. Although they loved each other, Maggie firmly stated that she couldn't marry Stephen. She opted to return to some dogs alone, accepting the consequences of her decision. Despite Stephen's warnings about societal judgments and implications, Maggie remained steadfast. In her attempt to rectify the situation, Maggie left the inn and made her way back to St. August, showing a sense of responsibility and courage to face the consequences of her actions. It was a tough choice, but Maggie was determined to make amends and face whatever came next. The situation was tense as Tom confronted Maggie upon her return to Dorcott Mill. Tom was visibly angry, expressing his disappointment in Maggie's actions and labeling her a bad woman. Maggie tried to apologize, admitting her mistake and expressing regret, but Tom was unwilling to believe her. Their mother, Mrs. Tolliver, intervened, coming out of the house. She showed compassion toward Maggie, going against Tom's decision, and expressed her intention to accompany Maggie. Despite Tom's anger and refusal to let Maggie stay, Mrs. Tolliver chose to support her daughter, choosing to leave with Maggie. Maggie's return to St. Aug's saw her living in a small house near the river, initially with her mother. However, Maggie desired solitude and eventually stayed alone after Mrs. Tolliver returned to the mill. Meanwhile, Stephen wrote a letter to his father, confessing his feelings for Maggie and acknowledging her goodness, asking for Lucy's forgiveness. Later on, Philip Wacom sent a letter to Maggie, expressing his enduring friendship and love for her. Weeks passed, and Maggie was sitting by the window, overlooking the river, when Lucy unexpectedly arrived. Lucy showed understanding and compassion toward Maggie's situation regarding Stephen, acknowledging Maggie's strength in sending him away despite her love for him. Lucy admitted her own illness and impending departure but promised to return soon to visit Maggie. They bid each other a quiet and heartfelt goodbye. In August, the weather was very bad. It rained every hour and kept raining for many days. People wondered if there would be a flood because the water in the river Floss was rising higher and higher. One day, Maggie received a letter from Stephen. It said, "My dearest Maggie, why did you leave me? You took away your love, and you took away my happiness. I want to be with you forever." Maggie felt lonely and sad. She sat in her small house by the river Floss, reading Stephen's letter many times. She cried a lot, and as the hours passed, night came. The rain continued to fall all through the night, making the river rise even more. During the flood, Maggie felt freezing cold. The river Floss overflowed, covering her house in water. Panicked, she opened a window to see water everywhere in the dark streets of the town. Spotting a boat tied outside, she climbed through a window and untied it, drifting away from her house alone. Terrified, the rushing river carried Maggie swiftly, past trees and buildings. Determined to reach the mill to find her mother, she rowed the boat through the flooded fields until she saw the mill. Calling out for her family, Tom, her brother, responded from the house, assuring her their mother was safe elsewhere. Tom joined Maggie in the boat, aiming for Park House on higher ground. As they rowed, the sun rose, offering a glimmer of hope. Suddenly, they noticed trees coming towards them in the raging water. Tom tried to steer away, but a large tree hit the boat, plunging them underwater. Days later, rescuers found Tom and Maggie, locked in a tight embrace, having survived the harrowing ordeal.